Welcome. Thanks for coming to one of our only in-person events we've had for a while. This is Phuc Tran's author talk. Make sure you're in the right place. Has everybody read the book?
No. Okay. All right. So wait, who you haven't read it? No, I'm not calling on you to single you out. That seems.
I don't make up an answer.
No, it's okay.
No
It's okay.
spoilers.
Yeah.
I'm reading it right now.
I do live, so I do make it. Yeah. Spoiler alert. That's the biggest spoiler.
And also welcome if you're joining us on Zoom. What we're going to do is in just a second, I'm going to hand it over to Phuc, and then we're going to do just a pretty informal Q&A chat about whatever. And if you're on Zoom and you have a question or a comment you want to participate, just put it in the chat or in the Q&A box, and I will read it out loud as the time permits. That's all I have.
Great.
I don't know that we need an introduction since I think you probably all figured it out, but
Yeah.
Writer, tattoo artist,
Totally fair
Latin
point.
teacher, I'm sure a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah. A bunch of other things.
There you go.
And also single parent who's monitoring his phone. I will not answer my phone unless it's my daughter who's calling. Both my kids are at home by themselves because my wife is traveling for work. So they're being babysat by Netflix and takeout. So if they call and I see it's them, I probably should answer it, but I'll just put it back here, but they will not call. Do you mind if I take my mask off so it's not so, okay, all right. Thanks for coming out, and thanks for reading my book, or thinking about reading my book. And after this talk, you may choose not to read it. And then there are some copies back there for sale if you'd like to buy one. So I thought I would just talk a little bit about where this book came from. And then I think book events usually have the author reading the book. So I would be happy to read that for you. In full disclosure, as an audience member, I find it a little bit like the long readings by authors, like it makes me nod off a little bit. So I'm going to read for a brief amount of time because I really just love talking to people in attendance. Like that's sort of like the most energizing part of any book event. So yeah, so I'm Phuc Tran. I'm a Latin teacher up until 2019. So I taught Latin, high school Latin for about 22 years. And then I'm also a tattooer and still a tattooer. And of course, if you've been teaching high school Latin and tattooing for 20 years, the next thing you do is you write a memoir of your life and get it published, right? The origins of this book actually came from a talk that I gave. I gave a TED talk in 2012. And during the preparation for that talk, there was a coach who, the TEDx organization matches you with a public speaking coach. And so during those rehearsals, the coach kept saying to me, you know, this is the talk of your life. This is the talk of your life. And that was sort of like their refrain for everybody. And I think it was just to kind of scare the hell out of us. But I sort of took that to heart. I thought, well, okay, like I guess if this is going to be the talk of my life, like I should just talk about my life. And I had never, up until that point, I'd never publicly talked about like the refugee experience or growing up in rural Pennsylvania or like growing up bilingual or any of that stuff. Like I just felt like it was just like, it just felt like too weird. It didn't sound like anyone else's story. And so I just had never, ever talked about it. And so in 2012, I just thought, well, hell, like if this is the talk of my life, like I'm going to go for it. You know, I'm going to talk about all the things that are important and interesting to me, you know, and sort of made me who I am. I'm going to talk about the refugee experience and growing up bilingual. And I'm talking about grammar and 80s pop culture and Star Wars and punk rock in 12 minutes. What could possibly go wrong? I just figured if it blows up in my face, at least I swung for the fences. So I gave the talk in 2012, and it got, you know, pretty, like it got really nice attention at the TED Talk event at Bates. And then it got picked up by National Public Radio's TED Radio Hour. And I was like, wow, this is, I guess my story is not that weird, or people like it or whatever. So so after that, I started doing live storytelling in Portland and in Brunswick at sort of live storytelling events, like in the style of like the Moth Radio. So like once or twice a year, I would sign up to write and then perform a real story from my life in 7 minutes. So I did that for about 4-ish years from 2012 to 2016. So once or twice a year. And then every time I would do that, you know, I would always get really great feedback. And that really sort of planted the seed for me of like, oh, like when I retire and like I'm like 85 years old and like my hands don't work and like my eyes are failing me, like that's when I'll write a book. And then in 2016, a New York literary agent saw my TEDx talk and emailed me just sort of out of the blue and said, hey, like saw your TEDx talk, I really enjoyed it. Would you ever consider writing memoir? It seems like you've got an interesting story and an interesting way to tell it. And I was like, well, like, and at the time I, you know, I was like, hey, thanks for watching the TED talk. You know, I'm really busy. Like I teach during the day, I tattoo at night. I have like 2 young kids at home, you know, like I'll think about it. And so I kind of blew her off. And then like every month for about like 4 or 5 months, like she would email me just like very nice, like, hey, would you still consider doing a thing? And so after about like 4 or 5 months, I thought, okay, I should probably, this opportunity doesn't sort of present itself to everybody. So I should at least make an effort. So I sort of sat down and I wrote, you know, just something, because that was sort of the next step, right? Like I might have an interesting story, but I might be a horrific writer, who knows? So I sat down over a weekend and wrote an essay. And I really just sort of wrote the essay that I would want to read about somebody like me. And it was very weird. Like I thought it was like a very kind of out there thing. And it ended up being actually the prologue to the book, like pretty much exactly as it is. But again, I just thought, well, I'm going to talk about like punk rock and like great books and like the high school experience and internalized racism and all kinds of other weird things and, you know, 80s pop culture, just because like, you know, I'm just a product of my time, right? I felt like it was really kind of like a weird essay. And I just thought, well, if this agent doesn't run away or just like immediately hit delete, then I guess we're going to do something. You know, it's sort of like when you get asked to prom and you show up and you're like, I'm going to put on the craziest outfit I can for prom. And if this person still wants to take me to prom, we're going to have a good time. You know, it's like, I'm going to put on a vest and galoshes and, you know, and flowers in my hair. I don't know. So yeah, so I sent her the thing and she read it and was like, I love this. And then faxed me a contract for representation. And then we started working on the book. So that's sort of the origin of the book. And I worked on the book, again, like teaching during the day, tattooing at night. I have 2 young kids at home. So I was on sort of this, what I called it like the boa constrictor sort of schedule of writing. I would write every other Sunday for a year. So like I was not like a wake up every day and write for like 2 hours. Like it just was not, that was not sustainable for me. I would sort of gorge on one Sunday. Like I would just write for like 8 to 10 hours and then nothing for 2 weeks. And then I would go at it again. You know, that said, in the intervening 2 weeks, like I was always taking notes and thinking about the book, and, you know, the whole book was sort of mapped out anyway. So it wasn't like I would sit down and sort of like be like, I wonder what I'm going to write about. You know, like it was like, I definitely knew what I had to write. So I just sort of had like page or word count goals for every Sunday that I would sit down. And I basically wouldn't let myself get up out of the seat until I sort of hit the goal in terms of word count. So the actual writing of the manuscript probably took, it took a year, almost exactly a year. So every other Sunday for a year. And then I submitted the manuscript, and then the editing process actually took another year. So just to give you a sense of what that writing process is like, you know, so generating the manuscript 1 year, editing it another year. You know, and I often will say to like young writing students or just writing students that, you know, I think that the editing process is as important as the writing process. You know, that writing the manuscript is sort of like getting to the top of Mount Everest, you know, and you're like, huzzah, I made it. And then if you want to get off the mountain, then you got to edit your way off. You know, I guess you could die at the top of the mountain too. I mean, that's certainly an option too. But if you want to live to see your book published, that's what you got to do. So yeah, and then So I finished the manuscript in 2019, or the editing was done in 2019. And then the book industry is very, they're very sort of market savvy. And so they were thinking like, when can we publish your book and have sort of like maximum impact and sort of like cultural relevance? And they're like, ooh, when was the fall of Saigon? And I was like, oh, in April, and they're like, okay, so let's publish this in April. We're in 2019, they're like, oh yeah, April 2020, like what's going on then? Who knows? Probably nothing, right? Like, I mean, let's just publish it then, right? What's the worst that could happen? And then, so the book came out a month after the pandemic had just sort of broke open everything. So that was also very exciting. Anyway, so I'll read just a short bits from the book. I'll read a little bit from the intro, and then I'll read a little bit from the another part of the book. So this is just from the introduction. It's from the prologue. It's just a description of my town. Nestled in the Susquehanna Valley town of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Carlisle Senior High School sprawled as a monolithic mid-century modern block of types, archetypes, and stereotypes. Industrial gray lockers ringed its hallways, the compartments narrow enough to repel most of your textbooks, but wide enough to collect the trash and detritus from your backpack, your own personal landfill. Linoleum floors, classrooms with chables, the combo chair tables of the 70s, blackboards, American flags, loudspeakers from which the wah, wah, wah of adult speak would drone. Our school district was so large that the juniors and seniors had their own separate high school, the so-called senior high school, and the freshmen and sophomores had their own underclassmen high school building. Carlisle High School stocked its seats and bleachers with a familiar cast from the 80s, the athletes who towered above the rest of us, the cheerleaders who lay supine beneath them, the geeks with their physics books under their arms, the preps with their tree-torns, swatches, and impeccable Benetton sweaters, a handful of black kids with MC Hammer pants and tall square afros tightly faded, punks and skaters with their leather jackets and black Converse, a few swirly hippies, the rednecks with their oily palms and cigarettes and trucks. Carlisle High School was another cultural cul-de-sac built with the craftsman blueprint of John Hughes, the Frank Lloyd Wright of teen malaise. Overwhelmingly white, Carlisle's population offered all the rainbows of Caucasia. The town's main employers were Dickinson College, the Army War College, a smoky stack of factories, and the service industries that had sprung up to support the aforementioned trifecta. In the spirit of public education, we, progeny, were all in the mix together. The itinerant army brats, the ivory sons and daughters of professors, doctors, and lawyers, the greasy offspring of waiters, cooks, and factory workers, and the token refugee family. The Tran family blended right into the mix like proverbial flies in the ointment. That is to say, we didn't. Carlisle's glitter was unmistakably 80s, but its structure was straight from the post-war era, bricked together by the mortar of the 50s. We had a downtown Woolworths with a chrome luncheonette counter and red vinyl stools, and a grand movie theater with its incandescent marquee. The four corners of Carlisle's town square were righted by 2 courthouses and 2 churches, Episcopalian and Presbyterian. God and law and law and God. It wasn't a subtle message to any of us living in Carlisle what was at the heart of the town. And the pièce de résistance, our high school was the town's designated Cold War fallout shelter. The blue and yellow radiation placards festooned our hallways, reminding us that we were only a button push away from nuclear annihilation. From what I gleaned on television, Carlisle seemed like a slice of American pie, a la mode. We bottled lightning bugs on summer nights. Trucks flew Confederate flags. We loitered at 7-Elevens and truck stops. We shopped at flea markets and shot pellet guns. My high school provided a daycare for girls who had gotten pregnant but were still attending classes. We stirred up marching band pride and fomented football rivalries. The auto shop kids rattled by in muscle cars and smoked in ashen cobbles before the first period bell. We were rural royalty, Dairy Queens and Burger Kings. I'll pause there. Every chapter of my book is named after a classic work of literature, and I tell sort of that chapter's story through the lens of those classic works of literature. So there's like Scarlet Letter or Crime and Punishment. So I'm just going to read an opening from the Metamorphosis, and it's just like the first page, half a page. Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis is a simple story. Gregor Samsa awakes to find himself transformed into a giant bug. When he discovers that he's a giant bug, he immediately looks at the clock and thinks about which train he can still catch to get to work on time. By himself, he's not freaking out about being a giant roach at all. His parents and sister, whom he's been supporting, freak out. His supervisor from work shows up and freaks out. Gregor has turned into a bug, but he does not freak out about his transformation until he has to navigate his relationships with his family and his work supervisor. You read The Metamorphosis and you realize it's his family's ugliness toward Gregor that moves the story. Gregor is now a giant roach and he cannot do anything about it. His family, instead of acting with compassion and kindness, sends Gregor to his room and locks the door. What's worse than turning into a giant bug? Turning into a giant bug and having your family act like a bunch of assholes. And isn't that adolescence? A biological change over which we have no control. And then our family, like a bunch of assholes, treats us like an insect in the midst of a metamorphosis that we ourselves hardly understand. Suddenly, with a different focus from the perspective of a bug, we see who they really are. Okay, so I'll stop there. And I'd love to, yeah, we'll just open it up to Q&A. Yeah, happy to A all your cues. Yeah, hi. Can you say your name too, just so I can, it's the teacher and I wanna, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. My name's Jeremy.
Jeremy, hi.
My question is, just kind of go back to what you just said about
Please.
chapter being after classical disclosure. I just went to that as a telling story.
Sure, yeah, that came from, so in the prologue, which was the essay that I wrote for my agent, I talked about my relationship with this other Vietnamese kid through the lens of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. And when I got on the phone to talk with my agent, just in the very, like the first month that, we sort of were embarking on the writing, she said, oh, I really love that device, or like, that conceit. Could you do that for every chapter? And I was like, heck yeah. It's just like, it's sort of like the way my brain is damaged, I guess. Like I'm always constantly like triangulating my experience with like a book I read. And I certainly, I was talking to a good friend and he said, you probably could have done this with like movies, right? And I was like, oh yeah, totally. Like I really could have been like, it's like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Goonies, Back to the Future. I mean, it felt like, but my first love, especially as a high schooler and like as a young person, were books, was books. So I think it just made sense to me that, especially it's a little bit meta, right, for my book to have like be an homage to the books that I loved, as opposed to movies or pop songs or whatever. But I mean, I think anybody who knows me, like, knows that like I'm constantly sort of like referencing those things. So it was my agent's suggestion, which I happily was like, yes, I would very happily do that, because it was probably harder for me to not do it. And just like a fun Easter egg was in like the early drafts of the book, like I sort of had all these kind of like, I peppered it with like lots of song lyrics from the era, and like the legal team was like, nope, can't do that. We're gonna get sued. Like, can't get the rights to that. And I was like, damn it. I still did. I'm not gonna say where they are, but there's definitely still song lyrics that they didn't catch that I got in. So I'm like, haha, and I haven't gotten sued yet. So I think I'm in the clear. So yeah. Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah. Hi.
Hi, my name's Leslie.
Hi, Leslie.
I have not read your book yet,
No, it's okay.
but my Bates Book Club
Oh, yeah.
chose it at my suggestion
Oh,
for our October meeting. So I'm going to be the facilitator.
oh, great.
So I'm actually here doing recon.
Oh, yeah. Okay, great.
research.
Yeah.
What I given that we have a limited amount of time to talk about your book, are there 2 or 3 themes or topics that you feel if we didn't discuss them, that people would be disappointed or would miss?
In your
what you
book
were
club?
trying to say? Yeah.
Yeah, gosh. Yeah, I mean, I think the refugee experience, I mean, I think like, you know, I think inevitably like race plays into it. Like, I don't, you know, it's tough, right? It's like, you think about the things that are the factors in my life or the things that I write about that I think other people may want to, like, obviously like great books and the Western canon and sort of like the connectivity of shared love of books and literature and sort of that piece I think is huge. But I think generally speaking, when I've spoken with book clubs, like I think they do want to talk about like racism, the refugee experience. You know, there's a fair amount of domestic violence and domestic abuse in there. So that is a piece that I think people generally, I don't know, like, does anybody want to, those of you who have read the book? Yeah, help me out, crowdsource. Let's wiki the hell out of this thing. Yeah. Like, what, I mean, if you, yeah, what am
Well, I think the subject you were just talking about, the books, for your book club, you can talk about all the other books,
Yeah, sure.
because each chapter is
Yeah.
based on a book. You could do a whole book club on each chapter and how it relates to the book that it's named after.
I mean, I think like, yeah, no, a big piece of the book is about my sort of struggling with finding a place in the world, right? And I think laminated on top of that is this idea of Americanism and assimilation, right? And like growing up in the 70s and the 80s, before culturally we had this push to like celebrate diversity and like inclusivity, like it was really like, I mean, like the program was like, speak English, like here's the brochure, figure it out, and then, you know, like signs and papers, and then you're American. I mean, you know, like I grew up on like that Schoolhouse Rock cartoon where it was like the Great American Melting Pot, right?
Yeah.
I remember that so clearly. Where it was like all these like brown kids getting like dumped into a giant pot and stirred around, and then they get like scooped out, and then they're like American. You're like, oh, okay, like I just, yeah, you don't, yeah, I guess you didn't
I'm
watch
way
that.
older than that.
Yeah. Does anybody remember that cartoon? That was, yeah. And we're, you know, as a kid, you're like, oh, okay, like that's the program, like the Great American Melting Pot, right? Of course, there's a lot of fine print to that, right?
Yeah, right.
And, you know, now I'm not so sure that like assimilation is really like what we want to be going for, right? Like that like somehow we're gonna like steamroll or flatten all of these cultural differences, as opposed to just like expanding the umbrella or the tent of what it means to be American, right?
Start replacing melting pot with one saying.
Sure. Yeah. So this, I mean, this book is really, I mean, if you want to read it as a critique, you know, it's not intended to be. It's just, it's sort of just like, here's what I experienced. Yeah, exactly. So like, you know, it's complicated, right? So yeah. Is that enough? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Hi.
One of the things that struck me.
What's your, I'm sorry, can you tell me your name
I'm
again?
Carl.
Carl, hi.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, Carl.
At the end of the book, you've gone through a lot and you've accomplished a lot. You're a merit scholar, you're going to Bard. You know, you've really made it in one sense by many objective standards.
Sure. Yeah.
And yet.
Can you also tell my parents that after we get it? Like, can you Zoom with them and tell them that I made it? They still send me money. Like, they don't send my brother money, they send me monmoney.
Your brother's a lawyer.
Yeah, right. My parents have no idea what I do. They're like, how do you pay your bills? And I'm like, oh God, I tattoo. They're like, people pay you to do that? I'm like, yes. Anyway, sorry, go ahead. Sorry, Carl. Yes.
And to observe it, reading it, to seem, you know, you talk a lot about your insecurities and the adjustment to being very conspicuous in culture, some of which I think we can all relate to a degree because one nation of immigrants, but think back to your grandparents when they came with the limited English skills and were spoke English with an accent, and they were always sort of the odd people out to a degree.
Yeah.
But anyway, you've got some very, you know, acquired credentials, if you will, or accomplishments.
Sure.
And yet at the very end, to talk about almost be willing to potentially blow it all in a sense, because you're still pissed off at the rednecks who use an ethnic slur against you.
Yeah.
And so to me, that was very interesting because you had a circle of friends and you had all this seemed outside confirmation or affirmation of accomplishment, yet this still triggered you.
Mm.
And so I guess that's a comment. One thing, I mean, why do you think that still got to you so much?
Mm.
And secondly, as over time, and maybe as writing the book, has that been cathartic in some way? Put that in a different perspective.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, so Carl's referring to this moment at the end of the book, but it was like, 3 weeks from graduation and, some rednecks sort of like, called me a racial slur. And it was hot on the heels of being chosen to be graduation speaker. So I was like, I'm on top of the world. And then, I mean, there's a couple of, there's sort of like a metaphor for that, right? It only takes one hole to sink a boat, right? And so I think I just wanted to, I mean, that really was my experience. And I wanted to sort of unpack the fragility of a person's sense of belonging, or some people's sense of belonging. And for me, I think that sense of belonging was very fragile, because it takes a community, right? Like it takes a community to decide that you belong. And I think, that there's like a dance between the individual and the group, and you're always in negotiation, spoken or not, about whether you belong or you don't belong, right? And it's by group consensus, and which group, and is this a group you even want to belong in or not? And and I think I always wanted to feel like I belonged in my town, and I did until people told me that I didn't. And then I was like, oh wait, I don't belong. As a very young kid, I was like, oh wait, I don't belong in this town. Okay, what do I need to do to belong in this town? Right, and the answer is nothing. Then it just feels like this like shell game, right? Where like it's like a moving target. It's like I've done everything that I could do to fit in, right? And yet I'll always be an outsider, right? So I think that was just sort of in a nutshell, like where my annoyance came from, or that triggering experience was like, is that small person's Taylor? I can swear. Yeah. Can I swear? It was just like getting called, like a gook. And I'm like, fuck's sake, like, what do I need to do? Like to, have everybody, and the answer is nothing. Right. It wasn't there. The writing process was not therapeutic or cathartic, like what's therapeutic is therapy. So I did a lot of therapy in my 30s. So I think like that helped clarify a lot of things for me. I just saw this sort of like internet meme thing very recently, and it said, nobody can make you feel inferior without your consent. Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Wow. Here I thought it was just the internet, but yeah. So, even better. Yeah, and I think that is a lot. But I think like if you're young and it's been internalized, right? And it's like, how do you sort of take that up, dismantle that, right? And recognize that it says nothing about you, and it's really about the world. I mean, and as a young person, and then on top of that, you have your parents, right, who also don't understand. Like, I think that's really tricky. Like, I think my daughters probably think well, I know they think I'm insane, but like, I'm always on the lookout for my girls, for, the patriarchy and like, racism and all this stuff. And they're just like, God, relax. Like, like they're like, you're looking for the boogeyman, but I want to be there to have the conversation with them when they experience it, which my parents just couldn't do, right? Like they were just like, well, we're not dead. Like we have jobs, like, like they're kind of stuck in the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like I'm up here and I'm like, I just want a sense of belonging. And my parents are like, we're not dead, like high-fiving, so I think that was also a bit of a disconnect. Like I remember there's a story, I didn't tell it, but like, I remember we were at a stoplight and like this truck pulled up and these guys like totally like, they ching-chonged us, which is like my brother and I use that as like they do whatever they do. And my brother and I, we were in high school, we're we're super pissed. We're like, all right, let's get out of the car. We're gonna fight him. And my dad was like, literally, he was like, relax. He's like, really? This is like what's gonna like get you guys going? Like getting ching-chonged in the car. And I'm like, oh, if it's, it's a slippery slope, Dad. If you don't stand up, it's like, my dad just couldn't give two shits. It was very funny. Anyway,
How old are your daughters?
they're 8 and 11. Yep.
Those are great ages.
Yeah. They still like me, I think. Yeah. Yeah,
Anita from
Anita,
Horizon.
hi.
Yeah, so hi. And I wondered, what do your parents know about the book? Because there's a lot of personal information.
Oh, yeah.
About your relationship with
Yes,
them.
yes.
What do they know about the book? And do they have any awareness about the sort of violent nature of the relationship, specifically your dad had? Or like, maybe let me say this, there's a part of the book where you and your brother are laughing because your mother says she has power, but your father has allowed her to
Yeah,
say that.
yeah.
And that's funny to both of you, like the irony, she doesn't even know.
Yeah.
And I wonder what they think about this being out in the world. Do they also are like, whatever, this is how it was? Or
Yeah.
are they like struck by this? Like you're, again, like an embarrassment, or is this like elusive because they don't really understand what you're saying?
Yeah, I would say D, all of the above. Like, so my mother is sort of like functionally illiterate, like she can read instructions, but like, I mean, this is sort of like, it's like a high literary style. So I think, I don't think she would get it. So she hasn't read it as far as I know. My dad did read it. I'll tell you about 2 encounters. So like my dad, the book came out like, sort of like crickets. Like I don't hear from my parents. And we're like on a family text thread, it's like the pandemic, but like, is everybody safe? And, are you okay? And are you wearing your mask, blah, blah, blah. Like 9 months after the book I've been out, finally I'm like, did you read the book? Like just asking, if my kid like did a thing, I'd be like, good job. Or like, I see that you did a thing, and my dad texted back. He's like, I was like, did you read the book? You don't have to read the book, it's a free country. And he was like, yes, I read it. It was very painful. And so that was the only conversation I had with him. And then for 3 years, and then I just recently, my parents live in just outside of Los Angeles now. So we just saw them in this past April for the first time in 3 years. And somebody asked my dad, we were having dinner, and somebody asked my dad, they're like, so did you read Phuc's book? And my dad was like, yep. And they're like, what'd you think? And he was like, I didn't like it, but it's his story to tell. And I was like, wow, like this is not he's grown as a person, right? I mean, and so that was powerful for me to witness, but they're not fans, but they haven't disowned me or anything like that. But yeah, I think it's complicated, right? And I think what's hard for my dad, or who's read it, is I think it's just painful for him to read. It's like it's not him at his best, not all the time. Like, and I tried to make it be as complex of a portrayal of him as possible. I mean, they're deeply flawed, right? And it's like, how do I hold the complexity of they're so resilient and strong and suffered sort of unspeakable losses, and they're deficient as parents sometimes. Like I just needed them to take care of me, and like they couldn't even do that sometimes. And I wanted to hold those 2 things in the book as much as I could. So I'm not sure if that subtlety is accessible for my father, and also it's like in the Confucian household, it's like Vietnam, China, Japan, Korea, like those, they're deeply Confucian in the sense that like kids respect their parents, right? And like do not critique or criticize. Like there's no customer service evaluation, right? Or Yelp review for your parents. It's just like your parents are doing the best that they can, and et cetera, et cetera. And like there's no space in that family dynamic for kids to air their family's dirty laundry or to any of that stuff. So there's lots of challenges, linguistic and cultural, as there always have been. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question from
yeah,
a
oh, yeah.
Zoom, someone on Zoom. You sort of spoke to this, but Jane asks if you have any words of wisdom as far as writing a memoir when your family members are alive and may have behaved in less than stellar ways. You sort of answered that.
Yeah.
Any words of wisdom?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, for sure. I would think Jane, do I look right into the owl there? Is that too creepy? Is that creepy? Like, does it, does it look like I'm looking through like a peephole on a door? Jane, I would say, my advice would be, I think when you're writing, I've heard this many different ways, but I'll say it this way, like write with the door closed, meaning that write assuming that nobody is going to read it except for you. So write for yourself and let it all out. And then when you edit, that's when you decide if you're going to share it with people, and you may decide that the thing you wrote will damage relationships. And if don't want to do that, or if you think that that's a possibility, you don't need to share it. But I think it's helpful to write everything that you need to write, and then in the editing process, decide whether you're going to share it or not. Because I think if you need to write it, there's energy there, right? Like it has to come out in some form or fashion. So yeah. So I think writing it is one thing, sharing it with people a very different thing. So you certainly could write a whole memoir and just put it in a drawer and never share it with anybody. But I think there's benefit to just the process of writing. Yeah, hi, and then I'll go back to Carl.
My name's Patty.
Hi, Patty.
Related to that, you talked about the writing process. I love that you didn't demand, X number of words a day or X hours, but in those intermittent days between the Sunday and the following Sunday or 2 weeks out,
yeah,
were you ever second guessing the closed door of writing, or were you finding connections throughout those 7 or 14 days saying, this is what I'm going to write about? I mean, you've mentioned your kids a couple of times,
yeah,
that was part of it, but was it also that you had put something out and then you were kind of distilling all that throughout the?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's I called it kind of, this like digestion or metabolizing time, and I would have early ideas. I would have a notebook on my phone or a physical notebook, and I would jot ideas down all the time. Or if I felt like I was stuck, it was lots of time. So sometimes tattoo clients, I'm always with you and I'm paying very close attention to tattoos. However, sometimes when you're just tattooing a huge track of black, your brain just kind of goes places, because you're just literally, it's a physical. So I had lots of time during the tattoo time where clients are quiet and there's where my brain was just sort of working out problems. So, and 2 weeks felt like it was just about the exact amount of time for me to digest either upcoming stuff or stuff that I was stuck on. So sometimes I would write and I'd be like, this is really clunky, this is terrible, I just need to get it out, I'll come back and fix this later. Yeah, so I think for me that worked really well, just because I think if I were getting back in the saddle on a daily basis, I don't know if I would have that sort of recursive opportunity to go back and fix things, or to give myself the room to be stuck, but just to keep forging on, knowing that I would come back and unstick myself later. So, I feel like people who make those declarative statements about if you don't write every day, you're not a writer. Who are you to say? You don't know my life. My life is a total it's craziness. I can write every other week, but all day, and that's what I've got to give. And you hear the people who say that, Stephen King, right? He says all sorts of great things, and he says all sorts of crazy things too, right? And one of his things is you have to write every day. And I was like, well, I mean, yeah, if you're Stephen King, you've got that luxury. If you're a working parent, and I do have friends who wake up at 5 in the morning and write till 7, and I'm just not that creature. But yeah.
Got another writing related question from Zoom.
Yeah.
Nancy says she adored your book.
Thanks, Nancy.
And what surprised me the most was your use of humor in sometimes dire situations. Is humor something you saw only in retrospect, or did you use humor at the time to get through difficult situations?
Yeah.
I applaud your creative and unique writing style. Fascinating.
Oh, thanks, Nancy. Yes, my therapist would say that humor is my first and still first line of defense. So it was definitely how I got through school and made friends, and tricked my wife into marrying me and all that other stuff. So yeah, I think it's just how I'm not I think I'm naturally sort of a joke maker, even probably at inappropriate times. So yeah, so I think there are moments in the story, there's a story where my grandmother is beating me with scissors, And I just had to make a joke. I'm like, well, you know, like, and I make this observation. I was like, well, at least she's holding the scissor with the pointy end in her hands while she's beating me with it. I don't know. How do you survive, right? It's just so absurd. But yeah, that was a question back there. Hi.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
I'm also wanting to thank you for the book.
Oh, thanks.
I think the story is so important. I think a lot of people that love the bookshop and
Oh,
we're
great.
just trying to talk about it. And one of the things that we talked about was how it seems that there's pivotal moments where things happen where people interact with you in a certain way at the right time. Getting from one to another. One of them being this
Mm.
spirit house.
Yeah.
About what they I cried.
Oh.
I was in the audience.
Oh, thanks.
I cried. That was one moment, and another one, that's your friend's brother, I think, basically told you.
Yeah.
And I was just curious if those moments like stick out to you now, looking back at them as transformative moments, or if you were aware, like I think you said you were kind of aware of it back when at the time. That was
Yeah.
a light bulb moment.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, I think you know, when before I even started writing, like I made a list of, you know, I went to, you know, a bar with my wife, you know, we ordered a few cocktails and I literally just like had a scrap piece of paper and I wrote down like every memory that I could possibly think of, like in chronological order. And then from those, I sort of like picked out the ones that I thought like made the most sense and could like sort of push the story forward. And then, I mean, and you know, some of them were just like weird stories that had like not really, but I mean, the ones that I chose to include in the book were all the sort of ones that were like, you know, yeah, deeply pivotal and important. So yeah, I think those always stood out to me, you know, just as a flip side. And there are some moments that you think, wow, that was like huge, but like nobody else sort of acknowledged it as huge. So I went on a research trip back to Carlisle in 2018, just to like catch up with friends that I hadn't seen in like 25 years. And so I like, you know, texted and called a bunch of people and we all met out for beers, you know, met up for beers out. And, you know, and I just wanted to see if like there were stories that I missed, you know, I was like, and I think his name is Nate in the book. I changed everyone's name, but his name is Nate. He's the one that like got into the fight with the rednecks right before I graduated, which is like such a huge thing. And I brought it up to him. I was like, do you remember like you got into a fight with these rednecks for me and you got kicked out of school for 2 weeks? He's like, nope. Like, don't remember. I was like, really? He's like, nope. It's just like, just another Tuesday for Nate, you know? But I mean, I think it just goes to show like how, yeah, I mean, our perspectives and the things that are, yeah, they're just so different, right? I mean, and that happens even within a nuclear family. People are like, do you remember that time mom and dad freaked out at Thanksgiving and they like threw the turkey, and then your sibling will be like, no, I don't remember that at all. But do you remember this other thing? You know, so I think like you could be in the same household and have like totally, or could have very different recollections of experiences, holidays, family members. And yeah, I think it's just that to me, like that is also sort of endlessly fascinating because I think about like, you know, what sort of impact I have on a person, right? That is like, I'm just like, I don't know, like, I don't remember that. Like, you know, especially as a teacher or as a tattooer for sure, you know, like people are like, do you remember you did this tattoo for me? And I'll be like, oh, like maybe, I don't, you know, but you know, but it's not to diminish the importance of the tattoo. It's just that like, you know, it's just it's just relationally very different. Like I tattoo people all day, every day as my job, whereas like this person got this one tattoo and it was like deeply meaningful to them and et cetera, et cetera. So like I'm, you know, honored to be part of that experience, but it's just funny how we're approaching that same experience from such different perspectives. So yeah. Yeah, hi.
Hi, Carl.
Hi, Carl.
You had brothers and sisters, and you were talking.
Yeah, just one brother. Yeah.
Did you had a conversation with him about how he was adjusting and his path and trying to fit in the way that you were working very hard at?
Yeah, you know, we didn't talk about it in high school or in college. And, you know, my brother is like the one person that I was most nervous about reading the book, just because, you know, I think of all the Venn diagrams that overlap, like his overlap with mine both at home and in our town. So, and he's also a lawyer, so I thought if like there was like any bullshit in the book, he was going to sue me or whatever, you know. So I was like, but so he read this advanced copy of the book and he texted me and he was like, dude, you nailed it. Like you captured both like the dysfunction of our family and what it was like to grow up in Carlisle, you know. And I was like, whew, like for us, you know, like obviously like Carlisle is a very different place for different people. But I just thought, you know, his sort of stamp of approval made me go into the actual publication of the book very easy, because I thought, you know, he's the one person that like could spot things that like seemed to not be true for our experience. And you know, so it felt really validating to me that I was able to capture his experience as well. I think our experiences were very similar. And I think even more complicated because he had me sort of like on top of everything else, you know, like this older brother that, you know, much later in our adulthood, we had this huge fight. And it was, I like made some offhand comment and like he took it really badly. And then we had this huge fight about it. And then in the aftermath, you know, it came out that like he really views me as like the person who raised him. Like I was the father that my father was not. And so like I was like, oh, like, and that made me think, oh, I need to act accordingly. Like I thought I was just making a crack as like your brother, like I'm your brother. And it's like, no, you're like kind of like my brother dad person, you know. And I think you don't know that until you have a big fight and then, and then it comes out. Yeah, in therapy. But yeah. So it's so my brother's great, and his experience is very similar to mine, I think. Yeah. Probably, I think you had a follow-up question.
There was actually that
Oh,
question
okay.
about what your brother thought.
Oh, yeah.
We've got one more on Zoom.
Sure.
This is from Brian, who is a teacher at Morse High School.
Oh.
He says 60 seniors at Morse High School will be reading Saigon this year.
Oh, boy.
Don't worry, I will be hitting you up for Zoom while with class. As a teacher.
Apparently, Brian doesn't want to keep his job at Morse High School anymore.
As a teacher, you certainly have a sense of how school has and hasn't changed since the 80s.
The library will be closing in 10 minutes.
Okay.
What constants do you see throughout the generations of teenagers? Maybe areas of improvements of today's kids over our generation that tell you the kids are all right? And we don't have to rush out of here.
Okay.
Say it later.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think the thing that's the same is that I think kids' problems still feel big to kids. So, you know, in the 80s, it was maybe like, oh, I didn't get a Walkman. And nowadays it's like kids have the wrong iPhone cover or whatever. And it feels really real to them and it feels really big to them. And I think the adults who were most influential and who had the most positive impact on me were the adults who took me seriously. And so I think that's really informed my teaching and my interaction with kids. I'm going to get on my soapbox for teenagers for a second. And so I'm sorry if you've heard me say this, like if you think about like when we're out and about in the world, like you're at your restaurant or like at a restaurant and like a bunch of teenagers come in and sit down at the table next to you, like you're gonna like people like kind of roll their eyes, right? And like my teenagers that I've taught talk about going en masse into a store and being followed in a store, right? And you know, you think about how we talk about, you know, if like, you know, when Hannah gets her driver's license at 16 and everyone's like, oh, look out, everybody, Hannah's driving now. Like, you know, it's if you were to replace teenagers with basically any other marginalized group, like, well, like Vietnamese people, right? Like a bunch of Vietnamese people come in and you're like, oh boy, you know, we're like, oh, look out, like that Vietnamese person got their driver's license. Like you would never stand for it. Like, that's just horrific. I think how we allow, like we all just basically spend 4 years like shitting on teenagers, oops. And then all of a sudden they turn 18 and you're just like, okay, like here's a right to vote and you might get drafted and like, good luck, right? Like we've done I think we've done culturally like a very poor job of onboarding teenagers into adulthood by not taking them seriously and treating them quite badly. And then we're all sort of in on the joke as if like, I don't know, like I try not to do that to teenagers. You know, I think, you know, when I stopped teaching in 2019 for a bit. But I think whenever I had advisees who came and they were really distraught because, you know, whatever thing happened, like, I just want to recognize that that's their experience and that's where they're at. And like, you know, if they're mad that like they didn't get the new iPhone, you know, they're mad. You know, am I rolling my eyes inside myself a little bit? Maybe, but you know, I want to also recognize that like that's the reality. So I think, I think the vividness and the reality of the teen experience is a constant. I think it's always been a constant. I think that we can do better as adults in meeting them where they're at and not dismissing that. Because they're gonna be adults, like in about 3 years, you know, and then all of a sudden, like they just spent 4 years being dismissed by everybody. It's like just sort of like cultural gaslighting, right? And then all of a sudden you're like, okay, now we take you seriously because you're 18. And you're like, oh, that's not, you know, that's not great, I don't think. Hi.
Hi, my name is Dylan.
Dylan, hi.
I was wondering if either A, you're working on already, or B, if this book, having started as a TED Talk, turned into, if it has another life ahead of it, that's maybe.
Sure, yeah, gosh. Yeah, this is the, like, did my agent pay you that's like the, like, what are you doing right now? Yeah. Yes, yeah, the like D, all of the above. So, let's see. So, the short version, there's sort of lots to cover there. Like the short version is yes, I definitely have written other things. There are other things that are going to be published on the horizon, and I'm working on other things right now. Sort of hot off the heels of this book, somebody in Los Angeles, like some producer, read the book and reached out to my agent and asked if I was interested in working in the writer's room on a TV show for HBO. So I was like, always say yes to the meeting, right? So I was like, well, let's get on Zoom and see what this guy wants. So I ended up working in the writer's room on a TV show for HBO for like 8 months, 7 months maybe. TBD if the show's ever going to come out. Like HBO, fun fact, only develops, they only greenlight 2% of the properties that they develop. So the other 98% of the stuff that they have people write, they just put on a shelf and they're like, thanks for your service, see you later. It's like R&D money. I mean, they make like $6 billion a year in revenue. So like, that's just like, you know, pennies. So that was just like a super weird and fun experience. And I think it just took up a lot of time. So I wasn't writing then. So I ended up writing a children's book sort of by accident, which I guess I can tell that you guys want to hear the story about how, so it's like maybe like 4 months after the book came out, somebody like messaged me on Instagram Messenger and they're like, I read your book, I really liked it. And I was like, thanks. So that was the end of that. And then maybe like 6 months later, the same person messaged me again and said, hey, I'm actually a children's book illustrator agent. So she represents children's book illustrators. And one of my illustrators and I have come up with a character and we need someone to write the story. We think you might be like the perfect person for it. Would you ever consider writing a children's book, you know, picture book? And I was like, always say yes to the meeting. I was like, all right, let's get on Zoom. So I get on Zoom and her illustrator is this guy named Pete Oswald. He's done like the Underwear Dragon and he did a bunch of series called the Food Series. It's like the Smart Cookie, the Good Egg, the Couch Potato. I don't know. If you have a kid who's like between 3 and 8, you've read these books probably. So I get on the phone call with the agent and I'm like, okay, tell me about this character that, you know, you've developed. And she's like, well, he's this, I'm going to use a profanity. He's an asshole construction crane. I was like, okay. And I was like, wait, so is the story like, he's like an asshole at the beginning and then like his friends help him. And at the end, he's like not an asshole. And she's like, no, he's like an asshole the whole way through. It's flat. She's like, we think you'd be perfect for it. I I was like, okay. So I was like, all right, that was like low key weird, but so I was like, all right, look, children's books are all 32 pages long, like exactly 32 pages, no more or less. It's like an industry standard. I was like, look, I'll write 32 pages, like on spec, meaning like you don't have to give me money. And if you like it, great. And if you don't, like no harm, no foul. So like I write this story about, the character's name is Cranky. So I write the story about Cranky. I'm like, I don't know, like it's a story that I would want to read to my kids, I guess, about an asshole construction crane. And I like send it to her. And then I like check in with her. I'm like, hey, did you like read the manuscript? She's like, yeah. She's like, I loved it. I called my editor at HarperCollins. I read it to her over the phone. I was like, over the phone. And she likes it. She loved it. She'll be reaching out to you. So in my meeting with HarperCollins, they were like, yep, we're definitely going to buy Cranky. And we'd also like you to write 2 sequels. So there are 3 Cranky. It's not, I don't use the word asshole in the book. I did try to use the word gas hole just as like a joke. And they were like, nope, you cannot use the car profanity gas hole. I was like, oh, I thought it was so good. So I have that coming out, and then I'm working on a novel. So I don't have like another nonfiction memoir thing sort of on the horizon. But yeah, but never say never. But yeah, so children's books, and then maybe a novel. Yeah. Yeah, hi Carl.
Well, I was thinking about you and I'm a writer, and I'm looking at your arms. I know you have a tattoo parlor,
Yes, I do.
and it just occurred to me that tattooing is writing.
Oh, you think
You're
so?
telling stories with your tattoos.
Oh, yeah,
Is that a
for sure.
connection that you
I appreciate that. It's a bit of a stretch, Carl. I think only because I don't tattoo what I want on people, so like most clients come to me and they tell me what they want, and then it's just my job to sort of execute it to the best of my ability. So I view it more as a craft more than it is like an art form in the sense of self-expression, right? Like I don't like sort of people don't come in, they're like, do whatever you want. It's just like, that's a lot of responsibility. Like I already just want to do a good job or a great job, like I also don't want to pick the thing for them. So, but yeah, I think there's something there, but I don't know if it's necessarily storytelling. but A for effort. Thanks, folks. Is this a natural?
This seems great. Yeah.
Natural. Yeah.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, folks. Yeah, if you did not buy the book, Mockingbird is back there with some paperbacks. I'd be happy to sign them. Or if you brought a copy, I'd be happy to chat or sign your copies. Or if you just need to get home and have a stiff drink, that's